Good evening, book lovers. It's Robert Boyd coming at you with another book report. And I think you can probably see that I'm in a different environment than usual. I've tried to move it into a quieter part of the apartment. So I'm right by my sink where I brush my teeth. And it's a little hallway and there's a little closet there. But as you can see, I've got books behind me because I've got so many books. They're pretty much everywhere in my apartment. If you are watching this on YouTube, please like it and subscribe to it if you feel so inclined. And also, I have a Patreon account, and I put a link to it in the description of the video. And if you're watching it on my blog, there's a link off to the side that you can just press, and it'll take you straight to the Patreon page. Today, I'm looking at this book, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, by Professor Eric H. Cline. And it's about the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations that existed in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Near East, including Egypt. In fact, I'm just going to read off the big empires that we'll be talking about. Egypt, the Hittites. The Hittites were located in Anatolia, and they're mentioned in the Bible, but apparently these are later post-collapse Hittites who were left over in colonies in Canaan. The Mitanni, who are basically, they're not that important to the story, but they're basically in sort of the northern Syria, eastern Iraq area. Kassite Babylon. Babylon was a civilization probably most famous for the city of Babylon and its famous gardens, but also for Hammurabi, its ruler who came up with the first known set of laws, and they were pretty harsh. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's one of Hammurabi's phases. But the Kassites were outside barbarians who conquered Babylon, and essentially, instead of raising it, they took it over. They just put on Babylonian clothes and became Babylonians. The Assyrians, they are a big up-and-coming empire, mostly in Iran, what we would call Iran, northern Iran. And last, but definitely not least, the Mycenaeans. These are the Proto-Greeks, and at this time, towards the end of the Bronze Age, it included the Minoans, who were from Crete. Their civilization had more or less collapsed, and Mycenaeans had moved in and taken it over. So, Cline basically spends a lot of time talking about the Egyptians, and partly because the Egyptians were really good at keeping records. And in fact, the title 1177 BC comes from a record from that date in the reign of Ramses III. He's he was the pharaoh when the Sea People attacked, and he wrote an account of it and how difficult they were to fight, but that the Egyptians were ultimately victorious. When the Sea People attacked, it was such a difficult fight, a difficult war, that the Egyptians never fully recovered. And within a few generations, the Egyptian ruling class had been replaced by various other peoples from Libya and other places that were eyeing the wealth of Egypt. And after the collapse of all these empires, only Egypt and the Assyrians survived, and in both cases in much lesser forms than they had been before. So let's talk about some Egyptians, and I'll show you some pictures as we go through it. Hatshepsut, I'm guessing on the pronunciations of these, so please forbear with me. She was a very successful and powerful pharaoh. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, Egypt was reaching the apex of its power, and the The pharaohs I'm going to discuss are the ones who oversaw this. So Hatshepsut was the second female pharaoh, and she ruled a pretty long time and was incredibly successful. But she was followed by perhaps the most successful pharaoh, Thutmose III. He conquered a bunch of territories for Egypt. I think he conquered Nubia, although I'm not sure. I might be jumping the gun on that. And Nubia was to the south, and it was a great conquest for Egypt because it was filled with gold. There were gold mines there. And also, he conquered parts of the Canaan lands, which would be Israel and Lebanon today. So Egypt's empire reached its biggest extent under Thutmose III. He was followed by an extremely interesting figure in history, Akhenaten, who was he ruled 17 years, so he had a nice long reign, and died in 1334 BC. And he was unusual because while up till now every Egyptian pharaoh had been a worshiper of multiple gods, Egypt was a polytheistic society, like pretty much every society then. And Akhenaten decided that there should only be one god that is worshipped, and that would be Aten, who he put in his name. The last part of his name is Aten. Aten is the sun disk. What the disk part is, I don't quite understand. I guess the sun is a round thing in the sky. And he was the husband of Nefertiti. So Akhenaten was monotheistic, but apparently, so Cline suggests that Akhenaten became a monotheist not because he was particularly moved to worship just the sun, but because he wanted to limit the power of the priest of all the other gods and other temples who had become too politically powerful and too wealthy. So it might have been he doesn't offer any proof of this, but it seems like a reasonable ploy for a ruler to do. He was followed by King Tut, and we fortunately know a lot about King Tut because he died so young, and his tomb wasn't discovered by grave robbers like so many of the others were. In 1274 BC, the first battle in the Bronze Age was recorded, where we have eyewitness accounts from both sides of the battle, which allows us to sort of get a non-propagandistic view of the battle. This was the Battle of Kadesh in southern Canaan. And on one side were the Hittites, who I'll talk about in a little bit. And on the other side was Ramses II. And Ramses II is a important and successful pharaoh. It is often assumed that he was the pharaoh under whom Exodus occurred, that the Israelites left Egypt. Whether they left by miraculous means, as described in the Bible, or not, I'll leave that for others to decide. Cline intriguingly suggests that Exodus and the Trojan War, another highly mythologized event, happened relatively close in time to one another, relatively close over the course of millennia. So he says they probably happened sometime between 1350 and 1184 BC. And after Ramses II, Ramses III was the last really successful pharaoh. He's the one who fought the Sea People. He was victorious, but Egypt was so weakened that it declined in power and eventually laid itself open for conquest by first Libyans and then many others, Persians, Alexander the Great, and so on. So I want to talk about some of these other kingdoms. The Hittites, for example. I mean, I've been showing you pieces of art from the Egyptians, and one thing that you have to say about the Egyptians is that they were really good artists. They weren't quite as realistic as the classical Greeks got to be, but they were close, and the Greeks learned a lot from them. The Hittites were not as sophisticated. Here's a portrait, a statuary portrait of one of their kings. Let me see. Let's see. His name was. I'm gonna mispronounce it, but I'm going to try. Suppiluliuma II. He was the Hittite king who was king when the empire collapsed. But they weren't totally, artless, because I want to show you a cup that was made in the shape of a fist, and it was fantastic. So, art-wise, the Egyptians were the best, in my opinion. But everyone else, every other empire had its own art that was pretty amazing in its own way. And of course, we only have fragments, and Egypt's fragments were better preserved than most because Egypt's a desert. Egypt was the only place where perishable things like paper survive. In addition to the empires I mentioned earlier, there are also important kingdoms like Alachia, which is the ancient name for Cyprus. And Cyprus was important because it was a source of copper. And copper was important because it was 9/10 of what was in bronze, and everything was made out of bronze. Farming implements, weapons, armor, and other things. And the other 10th of bronze is made out of tin. And none of the empires mentioned above or earlier had any native tin mines. So they had to import tin. And Cline suggests that the most likely source was Afghanistan. So imagine, the nearest kingdom is in what would be modern day Iran. So imagine going overland to Iran from somewhere in Afghanistan in the Bronze Age, presumably in a caravan of some sort. And there are also important cities that I want to mention one, Ugarite, which is a city-state in northern Syria. So it was a Canaanite city, I guess, but it was a vassal of the Hittites. But it's important because it was when they finally dug it up, which was fairly recently, which is one of the things that's interesting about this book, is that they found tons and tons of clay tablets with writing on them, because they weren't writing on paper; they were writing on clay tablets in cuneiform. One of them had an account of them being invaded by the sea peoples, who I'll get to again shortly, and that city was in fact destroyed by marauders of some kind. But it also had all kinds of day-to-day kind of things, including manifests for importing and exporting goods. And that was one of the things Cline makes really clear, is that all of these kingdoms and city-states and so on, they traded with each other all the time. The Egyptians would say, for example, hire Minoan painters to decorate some of their buildings because the Minoans were really good artists. There were goods from all over the Mediterranean shipped back and forth. And part of the way we know this is from manifests found in places like Ugarite and other places, but also we know it because they found shipwrecks. And underwater archaeologists have been basically pulling up all the items in the ships. And the items are from many different places. So the reason it used to be that they thought the reason that these places collapsed was the invasion of the sea peoples, whoever they were. But Cline suggests something different than the sea people theory, although sea people had to be part of it since they really did invade Egypt and other cities. But there are a bunch of things that are going on. And part of the reason that they all collapsed at the same time is they were all dependent on each other. So it was sort of a thing where if one of them collapsed, that caused problems in the other empires and the other anywhere else that trade was necessary. One of the things was earthquakes. There were a lot of earthquakes back then, and they can tell in the archaeological record if a city was destroyed by earthquakes as opposed to by invasion, because you don't have when earthquakes strike a city, you don't have like arrowheads littering the walls, and things just look like they've fallen over. And you also have more corpses because people are buried alive. And the thing that he specifically suggests that there was a thing called earthquake storms, where one earthquake happens along a fault, and then further along the fault, another earthquake happens, maybe a day later, a year later, whatever, and it might take a while for the entire fault to unwind all its earthquakes. And there are a lot of big faults running through Anatolia and the Levant. Combined with this, there's physical evidence that there was a drought at the time, and they find this evidence by studying ancient pollen, and the drought would naturally cause famine, and there are also written accounts of famine in Hittite lands and elsewhere. So that would be an issue, and combined with earthquakes, that's not so great. And then it was thought that the sea people, the marauders, they might be refugees fleeing from famine in their home countries, wherever that might be. And in some cases, he thinks that they might have been from other parts of the same empire. So, perhaps the sea people attacking Egypt were from Canaan or from Mycenaeans. They might have been from elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Or there might have been revolutions and uprisings of people dissatisfied with the way things are going. The earthquake this year, famine next year. And let's have a revolution. So all these things together, especially the interruption in trade, because if you can't get any tin, then you can't be a Bronze Age civilization anymore. He thinks that all of them together would cause the systems that had been built up, the palace/temple systems in each city, to collapse. And that's what seems to have happened all over the Mediterranean. The Mycenaean Greeks ceased to be a power. The Hittites utterly collapsed. As I say, only the Egyptians and the Assyrians seem to have survived and still had an identity as Egyptians and Assyrians, but they were vastly reduced and later were conquered. Although the Assyrians, actually, after the Bronze Age collapse, did make a comeback. Their new identity is called by archaeologists Neo-Assyrians, and they had a big empire, but they were eventually conquered by the Medes, who were conquered by the Persians, and were conquered by the Greeks, etc., etc. So he doesn't really go into it in much depth in this book because it's a short book. But what happened after the Bronze Age collapse is really interesting, because really a bunch of really big, powerful civilizations ended, and there was nothing really to immediately take their place. He suggests that, for instance, that the Israelites, who had been expelled from Egypt but went to Canaan, which is part of the Egyptian empire, might have realized, hey, the Egyptians are no longer ruling anything. Their empire has really shrunk, and the Canaanites seem to have been wiped off the map, which was in fact the case. So, hey, this looks like a good place to settle. Let's climb down onto these hills and settle in this big valley and call it Israel. And something similar might have happened with the Phoenicians, who suddenly become powerful city-states along the eastern Mediterranean shore and start trading with the rest of the Mediterranean and setting up trading colonies, including Carthage. The Phoenician cities will eventually be conquered by the Neo-Assyrians, but not until they've had a chance to set up a big trading empire, which will then become centered on Carthage, but also not until they have a chance to develop an alphabetic system of writing, which will be adopted by the Greeks many centuries after the fall of the Mycenaean Greeks. And the Mycenaean Greeks had their own form of writing, which is identified as Linear B. That's the name we have for it, even though that's not what they called it, obviously. But that was forgotten, and really all over the late Bronze Age kingdoms of the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. Literacy was forgotten. Scribes died, were killed by marauders, or famine, and the written word had to be reinvented in a sense. I'm not sure if the Hebrew alphabet comes from Phoenician. It might, since they are both alphabetic. But the Greek and Roman or Latin alphabet definitely come from Phoenician. So really what we think of, and monotheism suddenly takes root in Israel. And so things we think of as an essential part of the modern world come after the fall of all these ancient Bronze Age empires. One wonders what would have happened if they hadn't fallen, if they had been able to shrug off all those earthquakes and famines. And really, if one of those things had happened to a civilization, a big earthquake destroys a city, it probably would have been rebuilt. But if all of them happened at once, they're screwed. And that's what Cline suggests happens. Anyway, Eric H. Cline this is a really well-written and lively book, and I highly recommend it.